Well, my pleasure to be here today. I'm going to start up my traditional PowerPoint slide here to go through this kind of stuff. My name is Henry Dittmer, as Brock said. I'm a certified enterprise coach. For those who know me, you know I'm kind of a collector of coaching methods and practices and tools. So I'm always on the outlook for a different perspective about how to do coaching or how to be a better coach, or what can I do for my clients, as well as how can I grow myself. I ran into narrative coaching about 2 years ago. I got one of these infamous emails where it said, hey, come join a 30-minute web session and we'll tell you something that we're going to sell you later. And actually, it was presented by a guy by the name of David Drake. And the presentation really captured me. It just was like, wow, this is a whole different way of thinking about a coaching session. And it was really psychological based, but it was psychological based for me as the coach and for my client. So it hit two of my things that I tend to pay attention to when I'm surveying for things. The other part of it was that the mindset was different than what I had been told in a lot of other type of things. So David actually is an ICF certified coach. His program is ICF certified, but he actually challenges some of the ICF traditional process of doing coaching. So I got into this. I decided, well, I'll pay for the full set of lessons. Got totally intrigued with that. Really fascinating work, and then ultimately became certified here in the last 3 months. So we're going to talk about narrative coaching here. We're going to talk about it in the context, here's David's book and a definition of what narrative coaching is. The key things about narrative coaching is, again, it's about you as a coach and how you show up. What's your story that you're bringing to the coaching session? So the metaphor is always a story in the narrative coaching world. It's a lot about the process of coaching. So we're going to hit on a little bit of that here in a moment, but he basically talks about the psychology of transitions. Transitions that people need to make in order to move on from where they're at right now. The other thing that's very interesting about it is it only uses the content that's in the session. So you don't bring in, so have you thought about this framework as a way of considering what's going on in your life? Have you thought about this method of approaching a practice or so forth? You literally stick to only what is being said in the session by the client. When you first start doing it, it feels very uncomfortable because you're going, guys, as a coach, am I creating any incremental value as a result of that? But in fact, it's fascinating to watch people all of a sudden have this shift in that aha moment that most coaches just live for. And then he proceeds to say, don't stop at the aha. Go beyond the aha into an experience where the client can take that aha, actually design an experiment they're going to use in the real world when they go back. So it completes a loop, and I'll show that to you in a moment. We're going to do narrative coaching in the context of a particular tool. It's about triggers, interestingly enough. Lisa's going to be talking about triggers after this conversation. So it'll be interesting to contrast the different approaches, because there's obviously different approaches. That's one of the reasons I collect all the tools that I do. But we're going to use something about triggers. Triggers in the context of a story that they tell for itself. And as we go along, I'm going to highlight the narrative coaching approach as we talk about a trigger that you may have. Okay. So this is the overall coaching model within narrative coaching. So you notice there's 4 quadrants here. They're actually numbered nicely for us, 1, 2, 3, 4. The first one is situate. And situate is where the client comes to us and says, hey, here's my challenge of the day. Here's what I'm currently have on my mind. I'd really like to talk this thing through. And you'll notice it's in the outer world. It's about what's been going around them and so forth. Then there's a transition, and the transition is to search. And frankly, prior to narrative coaching, this is where I felt like I created most of my value, because the client now is trying to create meaning out of their situation with the help of a coach by doing a lot of powerful questions typically, or help perhaps bringing a framework to say, hey, have you considered leadership circle profile is a way of considering how things are going on in your life or in your situation here and so forth. And hopefully you're creating the aha out of search. For me, what was really cool is you look for a transition to shift next. So you don't let the client just go, gosh, I'm glad you had an aha. Best of luck with that. You actually act as a parent almost. It's actually the psychology behind this, a parent-child relationship. You act as a parent and you allow them to say and practice what they would do differently. How would they actually use the aha? What behavior changes would they do differently in their aha, given their aha? And then they design an experiment that's the transition to sustain, where they go back into the outer world and they actually try it on for size, right? So it's this constant stage, and you can see there's a spiral there in the middle because obviously one time around may not be sufficient to actually make a change in your particular life or circumstance. But it's a very interesting model to have in the back of your head as you're coaching. Is the client in situate? Are we ready to move to search? Has there been an aha? If there is an aha, am I taking advantage of that aha with the client to shift, to create a new way of being in the world? And am I actually creating some sustaining experiments that they can run outside the coaching agreement? So we talked about triggers. I want you to take a moment. Well, hold on just a second. We'll walk through the slide first here. There's a build. So there's usually a repeating narrative that we all have that's associated with a trigger, right? So what happens is some trigger happens, some little thing happens. Maybe it's interrupted by that team member. We've all had that experience, that one person who kind of speaks up in a meeting and sends us flying off someplace. And that's exactly what we do. We have a set of behaviors that happen, and then we tell them, and this is pretty obtuse. Most of you wouldn't say, I'll shut up, but just for the purposes of illustration, I'm going to just say, shut up, right? And yet I'm the scrum master in this situation. Probably not a good thing to do, but they triggered me. And the outcome is that perhaps the whole team gets very uncomfortable and we lose participation going on. So it's usually a repeating narrative we have in our life. It's a constant thing. Usually when I do this with clients, I say, do you remember that one event that keeps coming up over and over? Maybe it's with your spouse, maybe it's with your kids, maybe it's with your boss, right? That one repeating narrative that's triggered by something. The kid's going, you're just an old fuddy-duddy, right? And oof, off you go as a parent, for example. So take a moment, because we'll come back and use this here in a second. Take a moment and think about some repeating narrative for you, whether it's at work or at home, and think about what is, or get in your mind, what is the trigger that sets you off on this repeating narrative that doesn't wind up with results that you particularly want. So take a moment, come up with a trigger in a narrative story. Okay, hopefully you have one in mind. Like I said, we'll come back here and use this in a moment. Now with narrative coaching, what we want to do is actually slow the narrative down. So we want to be able to say, get them to tease apart what is actually happening. So again, we say, here's the trigger. And we say, hey, I was interrupted by that team member, right? So I acknowledge what the trigger is. Hopefully you've got a trigger in mind. And then what we do is we say, what's the story inside your head that you're telling yourself? If you had to pause it, if you had to slow it down a little bit, how is the trigger? What's the story happening inside your head as a result of that trigger happening? And, and I'm making things up for illustration here. Why do they always need to speak up? That might be the story I'm telling myself. There's other stories. So take a moment when you're thinking about your story and say, what is it? What's the story that's going on inside of you, right? And then the next thing is to ask, well, what does that story say about your identity, your personal sense of identity? In this case, as an example, I said, well, geez, I'm the Scrum Master leading this event. That's what I'm about. I'm supposed to be the one facilitating this, not them. They shouldn't be overrunning this thing. So there's a little bit of a soft shift between the story you tell yourselves and your identity. The story is basically that rhetoric that you say. The identity is, what does that rhetoric now evoke for you from an identity perspective? And then we have our behavior that we fired off with where we tell them to shut up. And then we come up with our outcome where the team gets uncomfortable and there's no participation. So we've slowed the narrative down here, right? The funny thing about this slowing down is we're only partway there in the search, right? Because if you look at this, we really are still saying it's all their fault. I am subject to the trigger. The trigger has caused me to behave this way. It's challenging my identity, and it's eliciting the behaviors that I'm doing. And that's usually what you hear a lot of people talking about, is just understand the trigger and don't let the trigger trigger you, which is not as easy to do as most people think it is. We need to have control over the trigger. And one way to think about the trigger is to actually, interpret the trigger in a different way, right? Now, in the slides that are or will be up on SwapCard, there's a tool within here that helps you do this process. So this is a chart that you would fill in order to slow down your story. So you see you have the triggered experience up front, just very objectively what happened. Somebody told you that you're what I call talking too loud, or somebody in our case spoke up and started to what I say, consume all the oxygen in the room. They kind of took over for yourself. And then you ask yourself again, what's the internal story that you're telling yourself? What does that say about how you see yourself? And then what did you do as a result? What are those behaviors, and what's the result you wanted to happen at the end? So I'll leave that tool to you to fill out later, but it's basically, again, slowing down the story. So if I go back to the situate, search, shift, and sustain, situate was just telling me the story in the first place, and search is slowing down the story, right? Now, we're still not done searching though, because what we had was an aha of, oh, that's the trigger perhaps, or that's my identity. There's also an internal narrative going on, and this is a different perspective at looking at the event that just happened to us. So as opposed to thinking about it as a trigger, think about it as some experience has now been violated. Some expectation is now no longer going to be met. So it's not the trigger that set it off. It's the emotional energy that's happening for me as a result of this trigger happening. I'm not going to be able to, here's a little icon for humor. What I hope to accomplish is now lost because this person is consuming the room, right? This is a significant, it's called a pivot. It's a different way of observing the narrative, right? It's a different internal way of observing the narrative. So now you're saying, what's the core value that I hold that's at stake as a result of this expectation being missed? So it's a different perspective. And it's the perspective that I think I need to add value. I need to be able to add value. Maybe leadership and management is expecting me to deliver value. So it's if hopefully you can see this is just a little different angle into the trigger of the story. And then that says there's some unmet need on my part that's actually creating the emotional energy here. I want to be the one that's in charge. This is a key point in when you're as a narrative coach to tap into, because we've now uncovered a different way of thinking about the story. It's not a trigger, it's a thwarted expectation. That in fact, there's some value that I'm holding to be true, and that now there's some need, personal need, that is not happening, and I am now emotionally charged in this. It could be a safety thing or a security thing as what do you call it? Sahota was talking about. It could be all sorts of other things. And this is the really, really, really cool part that I discovered about narrative coaching. We're in search. We actually want them to tell us the story, their narrative, this internal narrative, as if it's happening right now, at this very moment. And when we do that, the emotion becomes real and concrete in the room. It's not something reflected on. It's not something that's distant. It's actually physically in the room. And now you can actually step out of that while it's in the room and objectively look at that and say, geez, so why do you think you need to be in charge? When you think about not being in charge, what comes up for you, right? So a little more of the powerful question, traditional type of methods. So I still may tell them to shut up and I still may get the same outcome because we haven't shifted yet. We're still in search, but we've done something very powerful. We've created a different angle to the problem. We've thought about it differently. We're actually getting the energy and the emotion in the room. And I'm now beginning to wonder if it's really all their fault. Right? So if you take a moment, just think of the trigger that you had. Can you see an expectation that was missed for that? And I'm kind of curious to see in chat, although they won't let me show, there it is. I'm curious in chat, how many people saw a shift when they thought about the trigger as a thwarted expectation as opposed to some event, some trigger? Yeah, so some people like this, definitely. Exactly right. The shift from external to internal responsibility, stuck not being trusted, control versus mutuality. It's really interesting when you do this with a group of people. So you'll run them through this exercise in a room. And what you do is you have people share you actually share the story, the trigger. So tell a story of when you're triggered and what your typical behaviors and outcomes are. And people will pretty readily come up with them there. We all have triggers. We all have that repeating story for ourselves. And then you have people slow it down and people go, okay, and it's really kind of funny, to be honest with you. They kind of feel like they're there, right? That's the answer. And then you bring up this thwarted expectation. And it's fascinating how the energy in the room becomes very introspective. You have these pairs talking away and all of a sudden becomes introspective because it's a very, very different way of looking at why we have these repeating narratives we have. Now, we're not done though. We want to do something with this. Yeah. Okay. Now we want to change. Now we're going into shift, right? Where we're going to say, what can we do with this information, with this realization of the emotional energy that was created by the thwarted expectation, still acknowledging that the thwarted expectation was still a trigger, but it triggered this loss of something happening, right? So we're going to rewind the story. And the way we rewind the story is we say, well, we're going to notice the thwarted expectation. What I accomplished is lost. But we're going to go out here to the end first. We're going to say, what's the whole team? What's the outcome that I really want? And in this case, I want the whole team participating. I may want it to be fun. I need to state what I want this outcome to actually be. And now I want to turn my behaviors upside down. I want to think about a different set of behaviors that I'm going to do within this situation. In this case, I'm actually going to have a little more energy for and a little bigger stance on advocating for the whole team to have a discussion, as opposed to allowing any one person to consume it. So I'm going to actually advocate for the whole team. And now I'm going to say, what has to shift in me with regard to a need that I have, an unmet need? And maybe it's I can't be in control by reserving the right to facilitate, for example. Which means the core stake is still consistent. It might shift that I'm adding value. So we're designing, that's part of shift, a different way of approaching this. And in this particular case, we're rewinding the narrative. We're going from the front to the back. Right? And now I own it. And this is really, really important. When people own it, it's they're more likely to follow through with it than just simply an aha. And as a coach in shift, not only do they design this, but we'll even practice it. So I'll be that person, right? I'll say, so let's start talking about it, and I'll be that person, and I will be. I'm a really good role player. I'll be that person to the nth degree, right? And the question is, do I practice this so it's a child safety kind of thing? The client is practicing with me in a safe environment. So tying back to what Sahota was saying earlier, right? I'm creating a safe environment for them to practice this before they just go, oh, hey, thank you, Henry, very much. I'm going to reserve the right to facilitate. Whoops. I'm going to reserve the right to facilitate. And so off we go, right? And then they're out there in the real world and things don't quite go the way they expected it to, right? So I'm going to pause here and ask what questions, if you just put them in the chat, have come up so far for you as we describe this, because we're about to make just another little shift. What questions do you have? Wow. Either I'm muted or I've said this very, very well. Below. How do you translate the unmet need in the rewind, right? So what you're asking them to do is to say, if I know I want this outcome, right? This whole team participates. And therefore, one thing I need to do, a different behavior I need to do, in this case, advocate for the whole team. What would have to shift in me in order to behave that way? How would I have to see myself different? How would I have to respond to, or what value or satisfaction do I get out of the fact that I'm really headed toward the outcome and not the behavior? So you're asking the client to determine what they really have to, by behaving that way, what does it mean to them personally? There's another tool called immunity change that's very similar to this. You're really trying to understand what you're also, the unmet need translates an immunity change to the secondary thing you're wedded to. So immunity change says, I really know I should behave this way, but something's preventing me from behaving that way. I'm actually committed to something else. And in this case, with this, it's an unmet need. Yeah, competing commitment, Jay pointed up there, is very similar, right? And so I'm asking them to reflect, if I know I need to behave this way, what is the unmet need that I'm going to replace with that actually gives me the energy to behave in this new, different way? Some people are making more comments than questions. Cool. All right, we'll move on. So the tool here, here's the other half of the tool, is simply that rewind. So you fill this out going the other way, right? What would you like to have happen? What behaviors do you need to do differently? What would need to have to shift in yourself? What would need to shift in yourself in order to behave that way? And what could you tell yourself next time this happens? So this is your kind of internal trigger to start the story in a different path. And what would you observe if this was the case, right? How would you see? So that might be, in this case, whoops, I keep hitting that button. In this case, what did the observer see? They saw somebody speak up loud and I blurted out, shut up, right? In this case, what would the observer see? The observer might see me take a pause, a deep breath, and then actually say, hey, there's going to be time for all of us to talk about this. And now I play the story out in a more positive way. So again, it's a pretty cool little tool. You can see the two different arrows here on the side that walk you through that. Okay. So just, oh, my mouse is really touchy today. So I just want to reflect back on narrative coaching again, right? What we're trying to do is move the client through a series of 4 shifts, and we're looking for transition points. The situate is basically a little bit of clearing, and then, so what would you like to talk about? And they go, I just had a meeting again with my boss, and he kind of kept interrupting me, and it really caused me to shut down, right? That's the narrative. And so we just get them to tell us that story, what's happening in the outer world. And then we ask them to go inner world by starting to slow down the story and ask those questions of, so what's the story you're telling yourself? What's going on in your head as this manager continues to just interrupt you? And what does that mean for you from an identity perspective? And then how do you behave? Do you lash out? Do you just get really quiet? And then what's the outcome, right? I literally did this about a month ago with a senior director who had that exact situation. He would go to his boss and he would say, hey, we need to start thinking about dealing with this project in a different way. And the boss would just interrupt him and take over. And he felt totally disempowered by the whole thing, right? He couldn't figure out how he was creating any value add if the manager was already going to have all the answers and not allow him to speak at all and so forth. And so we actually talked about the situation, then we slowed down the story. And we said, what outcome do you really want? Well, I'd like the guy to listen. I'd like to actually have a collaborative conversation with him, right? And then you said, okay, well then what are the behaviors that you would have to do different in the meeting than just sitting there and being quiet and taking it? And that required for him to actually say, hey, I'd really like, what I call it, you listen for 5 minutes. That was a big shift for him and a big risk for him. And what did he need to think about himself differently in order to find the power to say that kind of a strong statement? And it was the fact that he actually had value, that he had something to contribute, that he knew more detail about the project than the manager necessarily did. And so putting those firmly in place, he was able to then, when the boss interrupted, in a obviously respectful way, stop the interruption and got a totally different result. So he ran a small experiment he did with somebody it was safe to do with. He tried it with a simple one, and it was a very cool experience as a coach to go through. So situate is the story itself. Search is this internal slowing down, this review. Shift is the rewind of the story. And then sustain is, okay, so where might you try this next? How would you identify the trigger and start to, what do you need to do to play out the new story, right? Those kind of activities. Now, all of this ultimately results in, and I put ... here, we've seen this in various forms all over the place, right? There's one model that says you get activate, whoops, boy, I hit that one more time. Brock Argue is going to come over here and break my finger. There's the business of I get activated, the triggered, I take a moment to reflect before I engage. I pause, basically, right? Emotional intelligence talks about regulating, rewinding, and responding. There's almost every model that talks about how to deal with some situation that has now put you in an emotional state. Says you really need to pause, you need to relax, and then you need to open. Because what happens is, again, very much about what Sahota was saying, when I'm hit with a trigger, or I'm hit with a situation, there's actually a threat response that happens for me. And as Sahota says, I begin to narrow down on things. So David Drake in narrative coaching calls it pause, relax, and open. I kind of like it because you can use a cool acronym of be a pro. When something happens like that, pause, take a breath. There's no need to immediately respond. Relax, actually feel yourself relaxing. Feel your feet on the ground. Feel your breath start to slow down. And then open up. What's possible in this situation? I had this as a personal experience at a HOA meeting. I live in a neighborhood that has one of those in HOAs. And we went to the overarching HOA meeting for the whole organization, and people were ready because there had already been some emails flying back and forth about people who were ready to want to fire the entire board, and the board was firing back. We had no right to do this. I mean, it was contentious already going in. And I thought to myself, sitting in that meeting, do I really want to be here? That was number one. Number two was, well, I'm here. What can I do to help them, right? And so as people started throwing barbs at each other, I actually practiced prose. I said, don't say anything. I really desperately wanted to jump in there and throw my two bits in, but I chose not to. I chose just to pause. And I did the relax. I actually sat there, and my wife said she could tell I was doing it. She was sitting next to me. I actually put both of my feet on the ground. I felt my butt in the chair. I put my two hands on my knees so that I could feel my hands on my knees. Some people will put their hand on their heart, which is a really good way of connecting into your emotions. And then I thought to myself, I'm in control. I'm not going to get triggered the way I did before. What is the new behaviors that I said I was going to practice with myself? And I saw openings, and, pat myself on the back a little ways. I made a couple of suggestions, and the room calmed down very, very dramatically. Most people walked out going, wow, that was not what we expected out of that HOA meeting. So the question is, what's your repeating story? Slow down your story and go internal. Be a pro, pause, relax, and open. And rewind your story. Use the tool to rewind your story. Don't let the trigger get to you. There are other ways to dealing with triggers. This is just one. This is, again, I was using it as an illustrative to how narrative coaching works as a framework. But it's really, again, it's very, very powerful when you bring people's story into the room and let them play it out in a safe place, let them practice in a different way, and then make some agreements to run a small experiment as we do in Agile on the new behavior. So Elena, I don't know if you're still on, if we can open up to questions, if people want to just unmute and ask questions.
Sure, definitely. So
that.
Everyone can unmute themselves, not everyone at once. Well, if you're brave enough to speak up, please unmute yourself and ask a question.
Okay, I'll ask. This is Terry Wilson. A lot of the coaching techniques that we talk about, learn about, and execute tend to work really well working with other coaches and team members. But when it's time to coach up, it's a little more difficult for, say, the C-suite or an executive leader above the level of VP to experience some of these coaching methods without being a bit off-put by them. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Terry. A couple of things. So I used to be an executive. I was a vice president of an organization. So I've been in the seat. One thing I will tell all of you that haven't been in the seat, I get up in the morning and I have coffee just like the rest of you do. And we tend to go into these conversations believing these people are different. They're not different. And so your presence that you bring to that coaching relationship is really key. If you go in going, they may not like this method, they're probably not going to like this method, right? I got to go in going, they're going to enjoy this thing. They're going to have fun with it, right? Michael calls, or Mike, I keep wanting to call him Michael. David Drake calls it serious play, right? You go in going, serious play is cool. They would like to play as well, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is, the cool thing about narrative coaching is you don't go in there with an agenda. You actually start the session with, so what would you like to talk about? This is what's a little counter to ICF, where you create a coaching agreement up front saying, so what are we going to talk about? What are we going to go solve, right? You actually trust that the actual story that's happening for that individual right then is actually going to emerge in the conversation and is actually going to create something new for you. So that's a big part of Situate is like, so what's going on? What do you need to talk about? What's currently going on? And I'll tell you, it is rare that you'll have anybody, C-level of otherwise, sit across from you and go, nothing, right? And if they do that, I usually say, wow, really? And then I'm quiet. And I'm quiet long enough that they'll actually fill that space. They'll fill that space, right? And now you're just two people talking about a story. And all you're doing is asking them to repeat the story in some way with a little bit of different tempo, with a little different perspective and so forth. They just fall right into it. It works very seamlessly that way. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
What are the questions?
Hi, Henry. This is Alicia. I've got a question.
Yeah.
Does this model still hold the person that you're speaking to or the client as creative, resourceful, and whole in finding their own solutions?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely does. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got a little tangled up on the model at the part where you mentioned the parental piece, and that's why I asked the question, because I saw those two things as being different.
Yeah. So a little more about the parental piece. If you think about the parental psychology, if you're a parent and you have a small child and you're always telling them what to do, you're giving them a mistaken view of how the real world is going to work, right? So we're not talking about that kind of parenting. We're talking about a parenting environment that creates a place of safety for the child, that the child can go and experiment and make a mistake and know that they come back to the parent and know that they're still going to be treated as a valuable person, right? It's not their fault. There's a learning in there, right? So what did we learn and that kind of stuff? And you create that environment for them to play out what has happened and to think about what are the things they might have done, design their own experiments. So they're creative and resourceful. They're the ones that create the new narrative. You don't create the new narrative. And then say, all right, so how can you go about experimenting with that? And by the way, when you're done with the experiment, I'm still here. So it's a model to keep in mind as a coach. Am I creating safety? Am I allowing them to experiment? Is it their discovery? And are they clear about when they leave this lower part of search and shift about what they're going to do when they go back to the real world?
Okay, thank you. I'm so glad you cleared that up, because I think parenting means different things for different people.
Yeah.
And I was just seeing those two things as different. So thank you for that clarification.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi, this is Sridhar here. I have a question.
Yeah.
When I'm in a coaching conversation, I tend to get onto that solution providing mode.
Yeah.
Right? Have you used this tool or that framework? So that I feel that need to add value. How do I stop myself doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's you and I are of the same cloth. I'm very much the same way. I go into those coaching sessions going, I'm here to create value by giving them answers or showing them some model. I lived, to be honest with you, for the aha. And the aha for me was I gave them some different perspective to think about their problem that, they go, ooh, never thought about that way. Whoa, I now know more about myself, right?
Exactly.
And again, as most people know me, I've got a crap load of those tools. Not that I don't use them, right? But I don't go in the coaching sessions with the intent to use them. They're only there if the client is actually stuck. So it's a great question, and it's actually what I liked about the narrative coaching certification. This thing was a 9-month adventure, just to give you a sense of the percentage, right? Of that 9 months, 5 months of it was about you as the coach. And what is it that you're bringing to the table? What is it that you need, right? By giving them answers. And once you discover what that is, and it's different for other people. For some people, it's like, I need to be respected. I need to be well known. I need them to want me to come back because they got something out of it, right? You really have to spend some time going, what is it that's causing me to want to bring something into the room immediately, as opposed to when they're truly stuck, right? Because you still bring it into the room if they're truly stuck. And then really sit there and work your own rewind of the story of what kind of behaviors you're going to do differently, right? And how can you manage your own, you've got an internal trigger happening. How can you manage your own internal trigger? There's usually something that we're wanting.
Yeah.
It's usually one of three things. We either want approval, so we want to be included, or we want security. I gave them a great answer and they'll hire me back and recommend me to other people. Or we actually are after control. We want to be in charge. And usually from a psychological perspective, safety actually, what we call it, closes in on those three things: approval, security, and control.
Got it.
And so I actually have an app that runs on my phone. It randomly goes off on my Apple Watch on my phone. It's just an app that randomly goes off, but it prompts me with a question. And the question is, what's going on right now? What's going on for me right now? And I just do a quick check-in, a somatic check-in. What's going on? Where's my head? Where's my heart? Where's my feelings? Where's my emotions, right? And then I ask myself, where's that coming from? Is that coming from a sense, a need of approval, security, or control? And it could be one of many of those, right? It doesn't have to be just one of those. And then simply say, yeah, it's okay. That's who I am right now. And where might that be coming from? And you just do that in a mindful way over and over and over again. And you'll have your own aha someday. My last one was walking through a casino in Las Vegas to get, right? The watch went off. It's like, oh, time to check in, Henry. All right, it's private security. And also it's like, oh man. And not that they always have to, but for me, it came back to my father expected that. Oh, okay. So now I can do, I've got something to objectively look at. I can use that as what I call it, the expectation coming into my story. My expectation is to please my father by the behaviors I'm about to do. Stop that. Catch yourself doing that. Pause, relax, and open.